Emerging Leaders is a group of brilliant young leaders who have joined the conference 2 days before today. So if you click on the tab, you can find more information about their profiles, about their agenda, and the speaker biographies of the program. You can then go back. You can click on OCP Policy Center. That provides you with more information about our think tank, as well as a link information about our activities, our convening, and our research. And lastly, the last feature of the main menu is the research and analysis. Research and analysis is an important part of a think tank's activities. So once you click on it, you can find more information about OCP Policy Center's research, as well as the Atlantic Currents. There was a presentation here at 9 a.m. about the Atlantic Currents publication. We invite you all to check the previous editions as well. And you can find hard copies of the publication in the Grand Foyer in OCP Policy Center stand.
So let's now move to the agenda, which is a very important part of this event. And this year's, and please make sure you check the latest agenda regularly, as we are updating it timely. And maybe we can see the first session, for example, the plenary one on the state of the world economy, which will start in a few minutes. So when you press on the window, a window pops up with the session description, the guiding questions, the moderators, the speakers, and then you can access to the speakers' biographies and pictures. Also, this year's plenaries and all the other sessions are color-coded, and this year's the plenary, for example. I would also like to invite the speakers to check their notifications they will receive through the AD Connect application prior to their sessions to join the green room for a small briefing.
The application also provides you with an option to bookmark the sessions in which you are most interested, and to also bookmark the speakers or participants that you would like to meet. For instance, if we go to the agenda, Yassir, you can look for Yassir.
So here you have the bookmark option, where you can select a specific person you would like to meet or come back to.
And this feature will also be shown once you click back on bookmarks. And if you go back to the agenda, if you want to bookmark, for instance, a coffee break, because you're very interested in meeting some people, some of your peers during the coffee break, you can bookmark it. And then once you go to the feature of bookmarks, you can see all of the different sections that you have bookmarked, as well as the people that you want to meet. And we highly encourage you to use this feature.
Indeed. So we can move now to logistics. And this is the first day, and planning for over 300 participants is indeed an art. And we want to make sure you have all the needed information and logistical support. So please make sure to ask logistics whenever you have the opportunity. Logistical information.
It provides you with information about your arrival times, your departure times. It has more information about the conference venue, shuttle services. But as Yassir said, if you do have more questions or you need more specific information, please feel free to click on Ask Logistics. If we go back on the application, you can click on Ask Logistics and you will be answered swiftly. So whatever questions you have, please make sure to click on that.
Perfect. Well, we can now see how AD Connect enables us to connect with each other.
Sure.
And we can do a quick brainstorming, I think, Lilia.
Yes, indeed. So actually, if you open the word cloud section, so it's in interactivity, I will ask you a question. So what comes to mind when you think? If you have your device, please take it out so that you can participate in this activity.
One word.
And if there's one word that comes to mind when we think of Africa and the Atlantic, time for action. That's the topic of this year's conference. No. Well, they took us straight to voting, so this is another feature that we want to present. During the conference, you will be using the voting system. Moderators will be engaging with the audience through the voting system. And the question we would like to ask you is, how many different nationalities do you think are represented in this year's edition of the Atlantic Dialogues? I will give you...
We're back to the word
We're
cloud.
back to the word cloud. And can we please have the word cloud back? Word cloud. There we go.
So the bigger the word becomes, it means that the most people are inserting the word into the word cloud.
And opportunities seem to stand out. So yes, there is a lot of opportunity when we think of Africa and the Atlantic Time for Action. And
all these features will be used by the moderators in their respective sessions to ensure sessions as interactive as possible and to enrich the discussions.
It's an important part of the way moderators will be engaging.
Yeah.
There we go. So how many different nationalities do you think are represented in this year's edition of the Atlantic Dialogues? You have 15 seconds to answer. So it's starting now. Let's see what everyone's thinking.
Not that far.
Not that
we have
far.
actually 80 nationalities represented this year at the Atlantic Dialogues, and this reflects the diversity of our participants and enriches the discussions.
So as Yassir said, you can send questions to the moderators, to the speakers throughout. Feel free to do that because we highly encourage you to be as interactive as possible. So Yassir, I think it is important to show how we interact with each other during AD and how we can share information with each other.
Sure. So AD Connect is serving the purpose of connecting us with each other. And this is very simple. You just need to take a picture of the barcode of the person of interest.
Do I have a volunteer who has downloaded the application already? Marcus. So if we go back to home, you can click on networking, you go to business cards, and then actually I just need to scan the barcode, the QR code. There we go. So I'm sending Marcus my connection request.
Perfect. So in addition to all these features we presented so far, we have also interactive screens that are available in the Grand Foyer. Four available interactive screens. The first one is related to OCP Policy Center, showing you the center's events, publications, and partners, and the whole network. The second one is related to a joint research project, jointly organized by OCP Policy Center and Texas University. And the third one is related to a joint research project as well with the Global Nexus, while the fourth and final one is related to climate change.
Thank you, Yassir. And there's a fun feature. If you take pictures, you can go to, so back in the networking section, if you go to home and you click on networking, you can go to photo gallery. We can already see some pictures have been uploaded from the emerging leaders as the program started a couple days ago. And you can click on this tab and a picture. And post it. There we go. So I hope we have convinced you to use the application. The latest tweets will be available. So if you go up here, I don't know if you can see OCP Policy Center is tweeting, Sam Mandela is tweeting, so you can see what other people are saying about the conference.
So we hope you enjoyed the AD Connect presentation, and we hope you will enjoy also the conference.
Thank you all for your attention, and if you need more information, there will be a Spot Me desk by registration with more information, with your QR codes, whatever you need with the application. Thank you all and enjoy the conference.
Welcome to Marrakesh.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Karim El Ainawi, the Managing Director of the OCP Policy Center.
Good morning. Salam alaikum. Welcome to Marrakesh and welcome to the Atlantic Dialogues. Dear esteemed guests, ministers, former heads of states, professors, friends, as was mentioned by my colleagues, we have about 80 nationalities here, and we have a very wide sectoral diversifications in terms of partner. Let me start with a little bit of history. You would think, for those that have followed in 2012, that these Moroccans, they are stubborn. They keep on, they continue. You know, when we started this back in 2012, the think tank, the OCP Policy Center, didn't exist. And everybody came and saying, the wider Atlantic, what is it about? You know, and you know, it kept going, and now it's a community, and you are part of this community, and it's very important. I think after 6th edition, we have been able to build a real community of the minds. And actually, last year, the theme was changing the mental maps. And I think as we are now, it's a sort of critical juncture in a very deeply divided world with very important changes happening. I will not go into details. You have the whole conference with very interesting themes on that. It is all the more important to get together. And I think the ambition here that we have is really to be the place where the North meets the South. And I think it's, throughout the years, it has been achieved. And where the North meets the South with a new mindset, I would say. And what is at the heart of what we're trying to do, and also with the think tank, is really to build a trust protocol. I think we are missing a trust protocol between, let's say, you excuse me to be a little bit caricatural, between the North. You know, there were international institutions, there's the UN, etc. I don't think we have the right trust protocol for the 21st century. And there are attempts. You know, the German presidency of the G20, they came back with an idea of reinventing the Marshall Plan. Not so much enthusiasm on both sides, I would say, of the world. And here, exactly what we're trying to do, if you can think with us, in terms of the kind of proposal and future research we should be doing also at the think tank, because it is what we do here also. We inform, gather your ideas for future research in terms of the nature of this trust, and particularly the role, a new role for international institutions, and particularly the financial one, that should maybe focus more on building that trust protocol, guaranteeing the relation, rather than the financing, which is not necessarily the big issue today. So we would love to have your ideas on that, how we can push this forward and how we can make it transformational. You will have 3 days of intense discussion, so you need to manage your forces. And you know, throughout the conference, it's a program that has also night sessions after the dinners for those that are, they're usually very interesting. And it goes all the way to opportunity also for you to meet you know, different people from different horizons. There's also, this morning was a presentation of an analytical piece we publish every year since 4 years. It's called The Atlantic Current. It's available outside. This is a report on key themes of the Atlantic. And I think that is what we're trying to do here, you know, convening discussions, but also fact-based analytical work that can inform decision makers and more broadly civil society. There is also a very impressive group of press which I invite you to meet from many countries. We have high-level journalists for many countries, both Africa, North America, Latin America, and Europe, that I encourage you to meet, and as well as our emerging leaders that have started to work. They're even more intense than your activities here. They've started on Monday, and they will show up in the program 23 times. They will come here and make you pitches, but they will also participate to various sessions across the conference. So this rebalancing I was mentioning about the North-South rebalancing, but there is also an intergenerational rebalancing to do. And I think it's important, particularly in Africa, where you have about 75–80% of the population that is below 30 years old in many countries, that there is a balancing and a space that is created for the next generation. To do that, this is the second fundamental objective of the first one is the North-South rebalancing, which I tried to explain to you with the trust protocol, and the second one is the rebalancing, the intergenerational rebalancing. And also for Morocco, this is a big challenge, how to give more space for the next generation, how to decentralize public policy at the local level so people can be empowered for their own future, for their own service delivery. How can we have the right checks and balances between you know, the central power, local governments, and the citizens. And this is also at the heart of what we do at the Policy Center. We have an obsession with these two sorts of rebalancing. And of course, we need allies. You cannot rebalance by yourself. So this is why we do it in an open framework and trying to have multiple stakeholders from back with us and with the sense of community that I think is what makes change in the end. You know, the energy, and also we need trying together to build the romance. You know that. There are some negative romance floating around the air that are able to gather people for a common objective without having them talking to each other. And there needs to have a sort of new romance that is much more positive and that is not today emerging, and that we're trying also to achieve, as a think tank. And as you know, people move with their hearts, but they get technical after a while. But the first, the emotion, the drive is also something that is very also emotional and deeply personal challenge for the coming years, and both, I would say, in the north and the south, not only the southern perspective. The third one is a fundamental point, which is, if you look at, and we'll have a nice session on the state of the world economy, but if we look, at long-term structural trends, you have basically two strong potential engine of growth for the global economy. One, is managing and being smart and, diffusing in all the sectors of the economy the climatic transition. And the second one is the emergence of Africa, which is in a way the last frontier of development. And the story of the continent could be the one of China, basically, along the and that's that's good news for Europeans. That's good news for the rest of the world, and that's good news for Morocco as well. And this is why Morocco is moving forward in terms of integrating itself with the rest of the continent. Great opportunities for investors in terms of infrastructure, high yields. When you have excess of capital, the issue of pensions in advanced economies, weak demographic dynamics. So that's how we see things. So we want to hear you across the conference. This is a very dynamic conference. That will be the end of a sort of address that I'm doing to you here now. But then we have very professional moderators that will be involving you very much through the app, also through, of course, question and answer and dynamics. So let me protocol together. I see Enola smiling. Thank you for your morning smile. I think that's, you know, and please do enjoy. Please our apologies if we have some mishaps in terms of logistics and organization. But please do reach out to the staff and we try to fix. Our intent is good. We want you to be comfortable. We want you to contribute. We want you to have also fun. It's important across the conference. So please do enjoy the conference and see you around. Thanks.
Ladies and gentlemen, our presenter at BBC News.
How are you today? Are you fine? I know I don't like audiences like that. I like audiences that are responsive. Okay, is everybody okay this morning? I'm a bit hesitant to get in front of the TV cameras because I've put on some weight since last time. But that's fine, it shouldn't be a problem. Listen, we're going to talk about the African narrative. I don't know what it means. Do you know what it means? Good to see you. Do you know what it means? Does anybody know what the African narrative is? Okay, I'm glad to see that you don't know either. So let me just invite my speakers today. Let me start by introducing Abigail Catherine Ezekwesili, who is an African powerhouse. A round of applause as she comes in. Yeah, she's coming, believe it or not. And then I'd also like to introduce Njoya Tikum from the United Nations Development Program. He's Regional Anti-Corruption and Economic Governance Policy Advisor. Ms. Ezekwesili is a Senior Advisor, Africa Economic Development Policy, but I know her because she started the Bring Back Our Girls movement. You remember that? Okay, come on, guys. Work with me. Let's give her a round of applause. How many East Africans here? Let's hear your voices. West Africans? The Southern Africans? Okay, great. Central Africans? Yeah? There is one Central African making noise for everybody. Great to see you. Any North Africans? North Africans? Okay, a few. We're in North Africa.
Any Africans?
Yeah, well, we'll come to that. Any East Africans? Oh, East Africans are usually the noisiest. Okay, now we're going to talk about the African narrative, and to get us started, I'd like to introduce you to two questions that we'll be asking you today. Number one, is Africa really rising? That is going to be the voting question, and you'll be able to vote by saying yes or no. Okay? And I want to hear what you think about that. Great to see you, Martin. Lots of familiar faces here. And now, as we get along, I want to get this conversation started by inviting you into the conversation. I want you to participate. You sit comfortably, but I want you to participate actively. But before we go further, I'd like Obi to start by telling us, what is the African narrative? This word is used a lot, but what does it really mean?
I think that it depends on who is speaking. If an African is speaking, the African is saying, give a narrative that is as factual as possible about the continent. In other words, acknowledge the progress that the continent has made, and also don't be sanguine about the challenges that the continent must address. If someone from out of Africa is speaking, it will be dependent they have bothered to acquire.
Or interest? Or the extent of their interest?
The extent of their interest will determine whether they get the kinds of information necessary for having a credible assessment of the state of the continent. But one thing that is generally acknowledged today is that there's a much more hopeful perception of the continent than had ever been the case before. And this started by the time the continent began to turn the corner in terms of economic growth. As we watched the continent begin to deliver at least 5% and a half economic growth over a period of a decade before the outset of the economic crisis of 2008, 2009, people began to see Africa as a credit nation. Now, what happened in recent times, though, has been that in 2015, Africa experienced its lowest growth rate since 1998, because growth levels went beyond 4%. And in 2016, I think it came at about 2.5%. So that's something to watch, because every time Africa collapses in growth, there are immediate consequences. There are many more women that die giving birth to children. There are many more children that die before the age of 1 at childbirth, before the age of 1, before the age of 5. There are many more children that drop out of school. There are many more lost opportunities in terms of household incomes. That welcomes between 12 to 13 million young people into the labor market every year. That's a disaster waiting to happen.
Right.
So if you looked at all of these, then it tells you that the continent can by no means begin to feel triumphalist about even the littlest of growth. This continent has not yet attained a sustained growth level of at least 7% annually, which is what it needs in order to make a serious dent on poverty. It is still the continent with the largest stock of the absolute poor. And so it must watch it. The other narrative about Africa is that everyone knows, according to the UN estimate, that by 2050, its continent has the largest number of young people.
Is that a good thing?
It could be. It's what do they call this kind of a thing? A sword of Damocles or something, where there's the side of the sword that's a good thing, there's the other side that's not a good thing. It depends on what you do with the demographic. If we invested properly and built them up into productive assets, then we would have the stock of human capital that would drive us into the second machine age.
So what is investing properly? What does that mean?
It means that our government, more seriously than they do, I get the necessity for emphasis on infrastructure, because critical infrastructure is important for making the continent a credible investment a region. However, if you do not invest in your population, what you're going to get would be a population that's without the kind of competitive skills to even think creatively of the new ideas that the world of the fourth industrial revolution requires of everyone.
You've got one of the frustrating things about what you're saying right now is that it's not new. It's been around for a while. Africans have known for a long time that they need to invest in their young people. And you have a place at the pace as it should. I wonder, from your experience, if there are any examples you can throw up that can actually show us where things are actually.
There are many factors that create the constraint to having the kind of outcome that we should already have in terms of Africa's investment in Africa's people, especially its young people. But a key part of it is really that when we talk about political commitment, it's become almost like a lingo, a cliche, and it shouldn't really be that. I am now more and more interested in understanding how it is that the politics of Africa is Africa's greatest obstacle.
That's a very interesting point. I want you to hold that thought. I'm coming to it because I keep wondering if Africa can give an opportunity to unpack a bit more. Let me come to you, Njoya. What do you do, by the way? You advise on anti-corruption, is that right? What does that mean?
That's very, very close to what I do.
Right. Yeah, could you just broaden it out a little bit so that we gain an understanding?
Well, I work with the United Nations Development Program, and one of the things we do is go around African countries, mostly sub-Saharan African countries, advising governments on how to develop responsive strategies and policies to combat corruption, which is a big issue on the continent right now.
Is anybody listening to you? Is anybody interested in fighting it?
Some of them are listening, I have to be honest. But if you don't mind, before I lose my train of thought, I wanted to pick up on what my coffee break, that we are studying her in school, because she represents the narrative of Africa that we have to put out there. So I'm quite pleased to have you here. The question, who drives the African narrative? If you look at it from a purely economic perspective, even from a political perspective, our narrative has never been driven by Africans. If you think about it, I wasn't born in the 70s, but in the 70s, we were told that Africa was a continent that was proud and scared of receiving investors in the 70s. So it was a continent that couldn't receive the amount of capital that the Western partners wanted to pour into Africa. We didn't have the capacity. That was the narrative then. We shifted into the 80s. And the late 80s, we started talking about structural adjustment. Structural adjustment also came from the external players. It wasn't an
The World
African,
Bank in particular.
The World Bank, not the UN, luckily at that time. But the World Bank in particular brought in the structural adjustment framework. That shaped the narrative of Africa. For almost in 2013, The Economist published one of their articles saying Africa is a hopeless continent. It took us 10 years to move away from the conception and the perception that Africa was a hopeless continent to now a perception that, well, now we're not hopeless, the continent is rising.
Okay, now let's just talk about that rising. First of all, I'm going to come back to you about corruption because I want to understand from your perspective how much of a problem corruption is. There are people who argue that it unlocks capital and it makes people, you know, when you steal some money here, you build a house here, you employ people who would otherwise not be employed. That's one strand. But there are various strands to that argument. But let me just come back to that whole idea about Africa rising. The Congo, which has some of the greatest minerals in the world, it can't make its own mobile phones when it's got coltan. How can it be rising if just recently Ivory Coast, and by the way, Ivory Coast and Ghana produce 65% of all the cocoa in the world, but they make almost nothing from it? How can it be rising when Germany, which doesn't grow coffee, does Germany grow coffee? Makes more money than every other African country put together from coffee. How can it be rising? Are we kidding ourselves? Are we lying to ourselves about the rising of the African continent?
I think you ask a legitimate question, and I alluded to it when I said that we cannot yet afford to be triumphalist about the better performance in growth that Africa has witnessed in the last decade, which of course has dipped. We're talking now of a possible growth of about 2.9% rate, so we must watch it. But the thing to always do when you talk about Africa is to remember, as one of my favorite Nigerian women said, Ngozi Chimamanda Adichie, Africa is not a country. Africa is a continent. So there are variated performances across the continent. That's one. Number two, the question that you ask is the question of how is it that Africa did not make the transition as quickly as possible from a mere commodity-based economies to really manufacturing and top-end services. And I think that that's where Africa's important agenda really to introduce a new element to our conversation, because I frankly don't think that it's all doom for us in the 21st century.
It goes back to the politics. Now, I launched a report for the African Development Bank, and I'll come to you on this one, Joya. And in that report, one of the things that stood out for me was the fact that the two countries that seem to be performing best, Ethiopia and Rwanda, were being bashed by the West based on some things about human rights, blah, blah, blah. And then you begin to wonder, is Africa's politics attuned? Should Africa be, you know, South Africa, you go and watch, I actually watch South African parliament for entertainment, because when you see what democracy does and you see what happens in South African parliament, you're like, okay, this is going to help me relax a bit. But then does Africa understand its political solutions? Is the politics right?
Point, because it depends on who you ask that question. The question you ask about whether truly we are rising is an important one because it ties to the political narrative as well. I think we are rising to an extent. I'll give you a couple of examples. Today, the country that is investing the most in Africa outside the extractive industry is South Africa. Nobody talks about it. Today, the biggest individual investor in Africa outside the extractive is an African guy called Dangote, 300 billion a year that he puts into the continent of Africa. If you even shift from a pure economic
$300
billion that Dangote invests across Africa.
How much money does that guy have?
Well, he's the richest man in Africa. But if you shift from the economic side of things, and you even look at the different indices that we use to judge our governance barometer, specifically Rwanda, everybody, you talk about Rwanda, people tend to look at Rwanda from a Kagame's point of view and the kind of leadership that Kagame has put into place. But we don't talk about what is happening within that country, Rwanda. We don't talk about the fact that Rwanda today is perhaps the most participatory democracy at the local level, more than any country, even in the West. We don't talk about the fact that in the Rwandan parliament, you have more women, actively strong women, more than even the United States, 62%, even more than the United States. But if you come to Ethiopia, Ethiopia has experienced double-digit economic growth over the past 10 or so years. The challenge we have with these politics and economic models that we've now projected on the continent is that we have a selective way of pointing on what works and what doesn't work. So if you ask a foreigner who has never traveled to Rwanda, all they think about is two things. Genocide and it's Kagame as a brutal dictator. Nobody.
But clearly, the only reason why the economy is doing well, some will argue, is because the politics is working.
It's because the politics is working.
Is that, so
I agree.
Yeah. So now, I wonder if anybody's sitting on a point here that they'd like to raise. Just put your hand up. I'll give you the first opportunity to speak. Really briefly, by the way. Can we get the microphones round? Where are my microphones? Okay, and as the microphones get ready to come round, I am very interested again in hearing whether, because what Rwanda, after the genocide, decided to dig back into its past and try to come up with solutions from its history. And that seems to have worked. Should more African countries be trying to do that?
You know, development is local. Development is people-owned. Every group that has made has to find it within itself to own its development. In many ways, I was vice president of the World Bank and responsible for the Africa region over a period of time. And one thing that was very clear to me was that Africa made a lot of mistakes. It's not okay to keep pointing fingers at outsiders. We had political leaders who did not define the strong vision, economic vision for the continent. If you don't have an economic vision for yourself, there would be a tendency for your partner to determine what your vision is. So let's note that. I interacted very much with the Chinese in the period that I was heading the work at the World Bank. The Chinese went to China for the great work that the World Bank had done for them in their country. It's less spoken of on our continent because we like to pretend that China did it all alone. No, it didn't. But it had a sense of the economic vision that it would drive. So back again to the political thing. I think that Africa's politics is still in infancy as its democratic politics. And please don't even think that whatever it is you see in any parliament on the continent that is a democracy is worthy of entertainment. Let the process continue until it gets to the point where the citizens understand that they can determine the quality. I tell you,
but the world is not waiting for this.
Hold on. Look at a country like India. India's politics could be entertaining too. But the greatest challenge that we had as a continent was the impatience about politics delivering the dividends that are due to citizens. And so often we had politics, a democracy is cut short. And then you start again, and then it cuts short. So we have had an inability to build institutions. There are institutions that are necessary to drive sound policies. With good institutions and the right policy measures, there is absolutely no rocket science to development.
Can I pick up from that? Yeah.
I actually wanted to, or perhaps I want to disagree a little bit with my big sister here in that it grew into its own political. It's more than 50 years since we had independence on the continent of Africa.
By the way, that is the Queen of England has been queen for longer than that.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
But I was going to say more than 50 years. Ghana got its independence, over 60 years now. Ghana got its independence when Ghana was actually far richer than South Korea. So the argument, somehow, with all due respect to my sister, the argument that we have to wait, we are still too mature for us to start taking the hard decisions, I find it quite difficult to believe. Now, very simply, the countries that we've mentioned, they're those countries that have been bold enough to say, this is our vision. We want to develop our own narrative. And they've been capable to defy external pressures for the interests of their people. Everybody talk about Rwanda, Ethiopia, but these are countries that does not develop their national development plans based on what France, Japan, China thinks. Have you ever asked yourself, why is it that today we have more Africa-Japan meeting, more Africa-European Union meeting, more Africa-China meeting, more Ghana and Nigeria meeting.
What's the reason?
Well, I think because we still have this apathy, we still have this feeling that for us to make it, our national identity, our strength, our strategy has to be tied to the people that used to be our, I don't want to say colonial masters, I don't want to put it that way, but that's the truth. We can romanticize about it, but the truth is that we still have those external influences that are determining the kind of policies that we develop.
Interesting. Francophone Africa, Anglophone Africa.
Can I quickly correct an impression? I am the most impatient optimist that you can imagine concerning the continent. So by no means would I have tried to convey that we need to, what I am making is that we must deal with democracy. Democracy is important for economic freedom.
But what is democracy?
Democracy is the capacity of the people to determine those that govern them. The right
but
is
that happening? Is that happening anywhere on the continent as it should? Because I'll tell you why.
That's the point I am making. It may not be happening at its perfect level. And I am saying that what we are watching is maturation process. Think of it this way. It might be 50 years, but tell you something. If you ever read the book of Malcolm Gladwell, it talks about the tipping point. We are fast approaching that threshold where the politics of this continent will no longer be determined by a club of parasitic elite, but it will be determined by emboldened citizens who now understand that the character will be determined by enforcement.
Will that be before the West dries up all the resources that exist on the continent? No. Will that be before? Because that's also an issue. These resources are not going to be there forever.
Be careful, be careful. I want a nuanced conversation. Don't make it seem as if Africans are these powerless people that, the West come in and just... Look, we must lay the blame where it belongs. Yep. We've got a parasitic elite class that acts almost like a criminal gang in our continent.
Let's give them a round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to open up the conversation to the audience. I really want I need to hear some voices from you, sir. Let's get the microphone in front here. Yeah, where are the ladies? I like to hear from women as well. Where are the ladies? There's a... Okay, what do you want briefly, please?
Marcus Freitas from Brazil. 2 quick questions. 1, what is the role of China in the new African narrative? That's question number 1. And question number 2, why can't we add value to the commodities?
Good point. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And then on top of that, I know people talk about African, the high-level conversations are about the Africa, this, Africa, that, 50 million jobs. But when you break it down and look at the data and strip it down, what does it mean for Cape Verde? What does it mean for Benin? What does it mean for Uganda, the Great Republic of Uganda? What does it mean for Kenya? What does it all mean? When you strip down the data, what does it mean for the individual countries?
Well, it does mean some interesting things because look at even the Côte d'Ivoire you spoke about. Côte d'Ivoire is registering the highest growth levels. It's like 8%. 8% is a very strong growth level to have.
But that's not reflected everywhere across the country.
But yes, and that's why I said we can begin to think of solving problems at scale. We need to look at Africa from a larger perspective. Don't homogenize it into one country, but at the same time, find a way to make sure that the learnings and the triumphs and the successes can flow around. So, for example, I'm huge on solving Africa's common problems regionally.
Like travel.
Economic integration is so important for me, for the continent. All the nodules of the continent, we need to join up. We need to join up. The more that the African is interested, it comes.
But can I just say, and I need to come back to your question, prepared to answer his question about the role of China, but then the influence, for example, of France. Doesn't Francophone Africa need to clear it via France first to integrate with the rest of the continent? I'm sorry, but this is the truth. When you travel to parts...
I know what you're saying. That of the, there are times when I feel like shaking my French-speaking African brothers and sisters and saying to them, you have to negotiate this matter of your exchange rate independence. Because that thing is really a major spoiler. The fact that it fixes them up to something that's external to them can be very, very, very much of a hindrance. So I believe that French-speaking West Africa still has a job to do in gaining that independence. that is key.
Let's answer the question,
Well,
and then we'll come back to you. Let's get a microphone to the lady at the front.
Well, a question on China. Oh, you want us to speak before?
No, let the question.
Well, Francophone
let me,
Africa.
Let me get him to answer the question on China
I was going to say, on the question of China, I'm a little worried when people paint China as this evil that is coming to Africa to, to take every resources. The truth is that...
You mean it isn't?
I mean it.
Okay, now go on.
I mean it. I mean it, and I would explain why. Because the truth is that before now, we've always had external partners. It might not have been China, but we've always had, it could have been France, could have been Germany, could have been Belgium. They have always been in Africa. I think the infatuation with the fact that China is coming about governance, they just care about extraction of our resources, it's a complete shame, or it's an abuse to Africans. And it comes back to what you're saying, that we are a continent that cannot negotiate our own, that we are a continent that should only rely or partner with a particular part of the globe, a particular part of the Atlantic, and should shun away our Chinese counterparts. So I think China's presence in Africa is a healthy thing. One, it expands the competition base with the other partners that we've been dealing with. Two, it gives us options. If we are not happy with the partnerships that we've created over the years, we can explore new partnerships. And to be very honest, the Chinese model, be it as it may, it has proven to work in certain areas. I'll give you an example where I come from. When I was growing up, we had a company, I wouldn't name the company, that extracted dynamite from my region. They came with an helicopter, they carried that dynamite and disappeared. When the Chinese came, they took a village just next door. They extracted the same stuff. They constructed a school, they constructed a hospital. What you're saying, I completely agree with her. Have taken the narrative or the blame too much to external partners. The challenge in crafting the African narrative from an economic point of view rests with Africans. You're right.
Okay. Now, I need you to, Madam, please.
Well,
did you say I have 3 minutes left?
That's a francophone.
Thank you. Yeah.
That's okay?
Yeah.
That's a francophone answering. I'm Aminata Touré, former Prime Minister, but I'm speaking on my own words, so there is no diplomatic issues. I do believe, from Senegal, yes, good friend from Gambia, that Africa is fighting back must be the right title.
Fighting back?
Fighting back. What I mean there is all we have talked about is something we have studied in different reviews, etc. Come to reviving Africa proud for our young people. If we are doing 70% growth like in Senegal, it's not only in English-speaking countries. We have the largest now growing, I'm talking about Africa, middle class. You have huge investment coming in the continent, yet we have the worst narrative in the world. I'm not sure that Africa hosts the most brutal dictatorship in the world. We don't speak in that word about Asia or about Latin America. Why do we allow that narrative in Africa? It comes back to what our founding fathers, the Kurumas and the Senghors, we have to bring that back so our room and in the country feel proud to speak about themselves, about their continent, and rise back. That's what we grow into our young people. And then we'll deal with these people, with these issues in the right way and refuse to be seen as the object of discussion of dialogue. What is the position of Africa about Europe, about America? That is also the dialogue we have to bring into the continent and stop being just, the crying and the... So that we need to fight back. That's my point.
Let's give a round of applause. Can you just hand your microphone to the gentleman next to you? He was one of the most vocal fighters of Yaya Jammeh. For a long time, I even thought he was the de facto leader of the Gambia until I met him. He wasn't. But tell me a little bit about African governments investing in African enterprises and how crucial that is for the transformation of the continent. We've seen that work successful in places like, and I wonder whether Africa needs to do a little bit more to move away from foreign direct investments and things like that and build the capacity, local capacity, more than it is at the moment.
I think really the problem of Africa is we still need identity.
What does that mean?
We had independence, but we have just taken the shoes of the white people who colonized us and became part of them. Most of us have our accounts in the capitals of these countries that take us as slaves. What is most important is the African identifying himself and herself with Africa is independence. I can now find it more difficult to travel to Mali from Gambia than when we are under colonialism. Then there is something fundamentally wrong with us.
How long does it take you to get to Mali now?
Now it will take you 2 days.
How long did it take you before?
Few hours. Because you can reach Mali from Gambia within 12 hours. And then the other thing is that the whole world...
So how is trade, intra-African trade ever going to happen?
Inter-African trade will not work because we have now, because of this, our small, unviable entities that we call countries in Africa, is our problem. Because the imaginary. But now we have strengthened it more than when the white person was. If there is no free movement of peoples and services, and we have not strengthened our identity, and the identity thing is the ICC, International Criminal Court. How is it possible that we Africans signed the treaty, but no member of the Security Council signed it? How is it called international?
It's headed by a Gambian.
That's what I'm saying.
Right.
That's our problem.
Okay, fair enough.
So we have to turn the sidelight on ourselves now.
Okay.
After 60 years,
I've run out of time, but
I'd like to make two points from their contribution, very good contributions. Number one, the young Africans that I interact with do not carry any encumbrances. They think of themselves as global players. They think themselves as people who have freed up to be as great as anybody. So it's being shaped by these young ones. They are the innovators. They are doing great things. They are in commerce. They are in technology. We don't need to worry ourselves about, you know, these kinds of narrative.
But they still need visa to get around.
These people are doing, the young Africans are getting educated, doing impressive things. They will claim the 21st century.
1 minute.
They are part. They are, by the way, the fourth industrial revolution is the time of artificial intelligence, blockchain technologies, Internet of Things. It is of everything. It is the time of simulation science and big data. Our African young people are into this. So we don't have. My real worry is our politics. We've got to fix our politics.
Okay, interesting.
Once we fix our politics,
please, before he comes.
Yes, sir.
Before he
very
comes,
briefly.
What I'm saying
I'm sorry for the guys who are putting.
I'm sorry to name
pressuring
names.
me to end this, but fine. Very briefly, sir. I'm under pressure to end this.
2,500 young Africans died across the oceans and across the desert. Why is the narrative here? It's the sixth.
But it's because of people like
Yes,
you, sir.
politics.
It's because of the politicians.
People like
the politics.
If Nigeria, the sixth biggest oil-producing country in the world, can have its young people.
It's the politics,
That's
sir. You're saying the same thing.
That's why when you say the young people,
So
still we have not given. That's why I said, let us put the sight-line. Are the problems?
Then there's no argument.
Yes.
Okay.
African leaders are the problem.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm glad we got there.
Okay. Yes. So it's a leadership problem here. It's a leadership problem.
I'm glad we got there.
And we need to end with you, if you can.
I'm happy the leadership.
I'm sorry, we have only a few minutes.
The leadership fight is happening at a different generational level. We are ready to take over anyway. But
what are you doing? You see, that's theoretically, that's a very simple thing to say, that we are ready to take over. But
let me explain
what
myself.
are you doing to take over?
I'll give you a very simple example. The narrative of Africa, and I think the Prime Minister is right. For us to shape that narrative of Africa, it has to start with me. I am of the school of thought. Give me a second. I am of the school of thought that believes that the narrative you are defining has to be seen in the way you carry yourself and in the way you behave. I'll give you a simple example. Look at how I'm dressed. I'm dressed in an African way. This dress was made by a small entrepreneur in Nigeria. We have to believe that what we do on a daily basis has a global impact on the way people perceive Africa.
But the decisions are left to the politicians.
Wait, but that's the other part.
And
the other part is that
politicians.
They will soon fix them.
But the other part is that
the young people in
but
Africa
you're assuming.
will soon fix the
No.
politicians.
I think you're making a lot of assumptions. This is the problem. You're assuming that
we need to end this now. Sorry, very quickly.
I was saying that you're assuming that we're not doing anything. Because I have to tell you, if you look at what has happened in Togo, if you look at what has happened in Gambia, in Burkina Faso, it was not them that were on the street fighting to obsede those people. It was us, the young people. So we just need to organize ourselves better so that we do what has happened in Gambia, in Togo, in many more African countries.
And in Zimbabwe, you mean?
Obviously. Where Zimbabwe is a different story.
All right. Let's give a round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. And to the question, the result, I've got to say thank you. My name is Alan Kasuja. Really good to talk to you. Thank you. Thank you. Right now. Okay, right now. I need the list of the names. Young leaders, please tolerate for a few more moments. So these young people basically are going to pitch ideas to us, and what they hope from you is that you shall shake up the ideas and make them a lot better than they are. And I need a timekeeper to volunteer. Do I have a time? Anybody willing to volunteer to be a timekeeper? Okay. Now, we have an amazing array of young people, and when Obi was talking about young people taking over the continent, you're going to see a bit of that in some of the ideas that you'll hear. And I hope that these ideas will be shaken up and improved by yourselves. Okay? And that's the purpose of this next session. I would like, first of all, when I mention your name, stand up so that we recognize who you are. The first one is Jean-Claude Muhire. Where is Jean-Claude? Is Avril Perry. Avril Perry is somewhere here. And then we also have Chimoabi Na, Jana Nelson, and Sei Oyenunga. Okay, just stay there so that it should be easy for you to get on stage. And we're going to start with, I need a timekeeper. Could someone from my team please come and help me keep this time here? Yeah, please. They all have a minute each to come and present their ideas and shake them up with them. I hope that this session works. Jean-Claude. Let's give him a round of applause. Jean-Claude is a young man from Rwanda and is doing amazing things in Rwanda. Okay, Jean-Claude.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Jean-Claude Muhire, and I come from a country of poverty. I founded Love the Kids Foundation, an organization which looks after some of the underprivileged children in my community. I have a project which is called $500 to poverty reduction, and it aims to empower every poor family that lays the children of Love the Kids Foundation so that they could have access to basic social needs. I would like to improve the living condition of 60 families in Rwanda that are living under poverty. I really need your help. Thank you very much.
Let's give him a round of applause, 37 seconds. His idea is quite straightforward, and let's now hear next from Avril.
Hello, my name is Avril Perry. I'm a New Yorker and a Liberian. Liberia's 4 million people are often overlooked by investors, but a perfect opportunity for me to test an idea, a zero-waste system that turns waste into power to fuel a microgrid. Despite miles of beach on one side and miles of rainforest on the other, economic activity and tourism are low, and capable youth sit idle. My idea pairs underutilized trucks, GPS-enabled by corporates in the country, with youth vetted by local NGOs to collect trash and turn it into clean energy. This project would address several issues: high youth unemployment leading to conflict, inadequate electricity, missed opportunities to develop tourism, and hygiene issues leading to epidemics. If you have experience in this, I would love to speak to you. Thank you.
Let's give our applause, ladies and gentlemen. Chimaobi now. Where are you from? Nigeria. From Nigeria. Let's give him a round of applause.
Good morning. I'm Chimaobi from Nigeria. We know Africa has the highest population of active youth, but 600 million people living in darkness. So this means that we have the greatest potential for development and growth. But the educational system has not been able to address these issues through the curriculum to help us improve energy access. So the Energy Ambassadors Project, ambassadors and entrepreneurs who are capacity building and mentoring programs entrepreneurship trainings would be able to provide rural access to women who are involved in productive activities, for children, for lighting. So basically what we need to do is to develop a curriculum that would address the skill gap that exists within the sector, because even though there are projects coming on board, we do not have the necessary capacity in terms of knowledge to handle this. So we'll need your support, technical support, to be able to do this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's give a round of applause. Jana Nelson. Yana or Jana? Jana. Jana, thank you.
Good morning. My name is Jana Nelson, and I am an American living in Mexico. Last year, during the US elections, we were surprised to find out that the reputation or the image of Mexico in the United States has sought to help change that. With the Aspen Institute, I am launching a 3-city study tour next summer for politically active Americans from the South and Midwest. I want to show them a Mexico that defies stereotypes, a Mexico that is not about immigration and narco-trafficking. I want to show them on the border the biotechnology hub, the high-end trade logistics. I want to take them to the binational airport in San Diego and Tijuana. And I want to take them to the fully automated auto manufacturing for Chrysler and Chihuahua, because it is not about stealing jobs, and it is about automation.
Right.
We hope that with that, American leaders of the importance of the U.S. as an ally.
Thank you.
And I'd like to have coffee with you to discuss.
Thank you very much. Oyenuga.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Sheyi Oyenuga, and I'm a Nigerian farmer. Every day I drive through the rural roads of Nigeria, and I see communities without access to clean water, electricity, and internet. Yet in these same areas, industry has access to these services. Now, using a shared economy, these industries can act as service providers to these communities and provide access to clean water, electricity in the form of rechargeable batteries, and internet hotspots. Now, I want to provide these access points connected to industry deployed, done at a low cost, and are highly sustainable. I'm looking to develop the prototype and speak to people who are interested in developing this idea. Thank you.
This is what the new look of an African farmer is. Wow. Wow. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much again. My name is Alan Kasuja. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mrs. Udo Akamimo, broadcast journalist at Citizen TV.
Good morning and welcome to this session on the state of the world's economy and its implications for development. It's a pleasure to be your moderator. So the economists and researchers broadly agree that the global economy is gaining momentum, even though that momentum is unevenly spread. Momentum is good because it's been a rough decade for all of us, starting with the financial crisis of 2007 and various. So what is the outlook for 2018 and what does it mean for development? We have several fountains of knowledge joining us to share their expertise, and I'll begin to call them out. Starting with Ottaviano Canuto. He's a senior fellow at the OCP Policy Center. For a second time, Ottaviano, if you could join us. He's also an executive director at the board of the World Bank for Brazil, Colombia, the Dominican Republic, Ecuador, Haiti, Panama, Philippines, Suriname, Trinidad, and Tobago. You could encourage him to come out, please share. Thank you. Please have a seat. We also have with us Ms. Antoinette Saye. She's a distinguished visiting fellow at the Center for Global Development. She's a former director of the IMF African Department, Finance in Post-Conflict Liberia. She is famous for helping negotiate Liberia's clearance of the long-standing debt arrears with the Paris Club and various others. Hi. We also have with us Luis Pereira da Silva. He's the Deputy General Manager at the Bank of International Settlements. He's a former Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Brazil since 2010, and a former Chief Economist for the Brazilian Ministry of Budget and Planning. Welcome. And completing the lineup, we have Dominique Strauss-Kahn. He's a director at Parnasse International. He's a former member of the French National Assembly, a professor of economy. He chaired the Finance Committee. He's a former Minister of Industry and International Trade, former Minister of Economy. So yes, we have quite the illustrious panel before us. But before we hear from them, let's watch this video that captures what we will be discussing today.
The global economy is gaining momentum, and this is most clearly seen in Asia and Europe. The global recovery is very uneven, with commodity exporters lagging. Risks are significant: rapid tightening of global financial conditions, debt, protectionism, and political rifts. In addition, weak productivity growth and aging populations suggest a period of slower long-term growth. Are current consensus forecasts for growth in 2018 realistic? Which downside risks are most likely and potent? Is the world bound for lower growth in the long term? What are the prospects for economic convergence between advanced and developing countries? What are the most apt policy responses to the present challenges?
For this session, before we hear from our panelists, I'd like to hear from you. So please take out your mobile phones and go to AD Connect. And I have a poll question for you. If we could display the poll question. What is your outlook for the global economy in 2018? Do you think it's one, great, we're growing, growing, growing? We're sunshiny, happy people? Do you think it's what the economists said, whatever it is they're saying? Or three, do you think there'll be a new crisis and the sky will fall on our heads? Okay? So please vote on that. I think you've got, what, 15 seconds or thereabouts? Just any of these. Just tell us what you think about the global economy. Okay? Sunshiny, happy people. We're growing. Whatever the economist said, or the sky is falling on our heads.
Wow. Wow, look at that.
So, panelists, you have your work cut out for you. We all seem to think that the sky is going to fall on our heads, right? So you will notice that Brazil accounts for 50% of this panel. You will also notice that this panel is constituted of people with IMF and World Bank experience. There was a happy reunion before we came out here. But we'll get started. So, Otaviano, I'll start with you, given your experience. The economists tell us that we're turning a corner for the better, despite our feeling that the sky is inches away from our head. Would you agree with that, things are going better?
Yes. I guess using the analogy of the sky, the most common phrase heard in circles discussing the global economy recently has been something like, the sun is shining all over the global economy, and that stems from the fact that we are to synchronize global economic recovery, at least as far as the big, large economic zones of the world are concerned, to see today, the Federal Reserve Open Market Committee outlining a forecast of higher growth for the U.S. economy next year. They will probably hike the interest rate in 25 basis points. We're also likely to see something a bit more optimistic on the European Central Bank side. So that's for the sun shining. But at the same time, we also have some clouds over there that may take off the shine from the sun. And they have to do with the fact that we will be entering into uncharted territory in the following, in the future ahead of the monetary policies, the unconventional monetary policies by the major central banks. And that will bring some pressure on asset price, which seem to be overvalued. There is the risk, I expect Luis probably to mention something on the corporate debt, and there is China, which is a chapter apart. But again, just to conclude my initial take, following the phrase that stems from Kennedy, in fact, it's the time to fix the roof exactly when the sun is shining. So everything that I was saying, which is a relatively upbeat take on the near future, should be used as an opportunity to fix the roof.
Okay, so what would your forecast be if you've talked about synchronized growth?
Yeah.
And the economists tell us that we have, I think, achieved 3% growth globally in 2017.
Yes, it's something that will be in between 3% and 3.5%. It depends on whether we use PPP exchange rates or not. But the fact is, of course, this is uneven. For instance, the sun will come to shine in this part of the world where we are now.
What do you mean by this part of the world? North
let's
Africa,
say Sub-Saharan Africa and Middle East and North Africa, not necessarily at the same intensity as it will be the case in Europe and the US. But nonetheless, the commodity price that you mentioned, they are in the peak, but at least they have improved a bit vis-a-vis 2 years ago. And there is some movement toward, let's say, some parts of Africa trying to engage into manufacturing-led development to the extent of possible. One Belt, One Road initiative from China is something that will bring investments in some parts of Africa, so it's not bad.
I was going to pick you up on Africa because you left it out in your initial remarks. Antoinette, I'll come to you because, of course, a lot of your career has been spent on the continent, and so if we're told that what contribution does Africa make to the overall picture?
Well, it's certainly the case that, let me start by saying, of course, Sub-Saharan Africa, which is what I know best, but Africa more generally, has been in a bit of a rough patch in the course of the last couple of years. Last year in particular, very low growth performance in Sub-Saharan Africa, just 1.4%, which is the lowest that the region had seen in more than 20 years. And previously, of course, the robust growth that the region had seen was accountable to three factors broadly. The global environment, which was supportive of robust growth, high commodity prices, and capital flows that were quite important. Some of that high is you see commodity producers in particular bearing the brunt of the lower growth we see in Sub-Saharan Africa. Policies and institutions which accounted for quite a bit of the performance in the past. Policies a bit behind the curve in a number of countries in responding to the oil price shock in particular. The capital flows improving this year in particular for the region. A number of frontier economies have had better access to financial flows. Sovereign bond issuances are much higher than they were last year, for example. A lot that needs to be done to really get growth back to a point where it's actually enough to
And so we'll come to
make
what
for,
needs to be.
right.
Octavio in his comments talked about uncharted waters, you know, the sun, you know, shining unevenly on, you know, parts of the world. What are the prospects, therefore, for convergence and growth? If Africa has been doing badly the last couple of years, and Europe and Asia, well, Europe, you know, primarily picking up, do you see any hope for some sort of converged growth?
I think if you look at the group of emerging market and developing countries as a whole, there is some prospects of some moderate improvement in convergence, in that the rate of per capita income growth foreseen for advanced countries in the course of 2017 to 2022 is only some 1 rate higher in that emerging group of countries and developing countries as a group. But that is really driven by China and India, the bulk of that. And so across a number of other countries, and I think 43 countries in that group, will actually see negative per capita income growth. So, you know, convergence, you know, challenged, frankly. And when you look at sub-Saharan Africa more specifically, the rate of growth in the course of this year is only going to be some 2.6% and moving to 3.4% next year. Still barely enough to make for an increase in per capita income growth. Some 12 countries in the region actually are going to be seeing negative, not the best prospect that the region has seen for some time. A lot can change, of course, if policies take up the challenge of moving a bit faster than they have, especially on the fiscal consolidation front, especially in the oil exporting countries.
Mm-hmm. Luis, I'll come to you because from where you sit at the Bank of International Settlements, you know, part of your remit is promoting fiscal stability. So we see growth in the world despite the determined efforts of some politicians whom we won't name in this session. What are the downsides of this unequal growth that we're seeing?
So first, thank you for having me, and of course I'm speaking on a personal capacity here. We have seen the global economy out, this is good. And on the financial stability front, some regulatory reforms have been completed, so this is important. And we have been growing at a reasonable speed, and I think the numbers, if you look at the last quarterly annualized figures for the US and for Europe, are good. However, this has been going on with rising inequality, with a rising set of protectionist stances, with unanswered questions about climate change. And these, I think, are the serious issues that we are leaving for the emerging leaders. We are leaving a legacy of unanswered problems, very global problems.
How many African countries are represented in the BIS?
You have and a good African constituency at the BIS. But the point is, look, I have the figure right in front of me, but we have, for instance, not only at the BIS, but also at the FSB, a number of African constituents that are in there. The point is, what are we going to do with these global problems if we have at the same time a failing political system, particularly in advanced economies? We are in a situation where the effects of the inequality arising from globalization and also the global financial crisis have, in a sense, economies political threat. And these societies have developed instead an incapacity to address some of the structural problems that are necessary to undertake reforms and that are necessary to then grow with more quality, meaning with less of a carbon print, and with more equality in terms of income distribution. So therefore, we are in a dilemma, we are in a conundrum. In order to grow faster, in order to grow of a different type of quality, in order to engineer reforms, we need a political system that can produce more consensus. And this is not being the case because the fat tails of the distribution of the political spectrum in advanced economy have been particularly creating impediments for creating reforms, legitimacy, and social consent. And this because that provides a difficult ground to engineer more policy for the rest of the world.
Okay, so let me challenge you though, because you talk about the advanced economies, you've told us about Europe and the US, and that assumes that that other economies in the world, the emerging economies, do not have a shot at A, growing, and B, determining global policy. And this continues from the session we heard, the Africa Rising session. So if we were to look at the emerging economies and their growth and how it affects the global economic system, global growth, what would your prediction be?
I think the emerging economies are doing better rates for them. If you look at China, they are participating at the greater share to global growth. But in order to make this sustainable, in order to set a sustainable growth path for the global economy, their voice needs to be more heard in global forum, and this is a place, for example, where we are doing just that, but also in terms of the prevention from some of the protectionist stances that we've been seeing and the fragmentation of the global financial system. It is important that some of these global problems that I mentioned are answered at the global level. So it's impossible to have global issues such as the one we are confronted with being addressed by exactly the dialogue we are seeing. That some of the global issues are now being essentially unanswered because of the separatists, the nationalists, the protectionist stance in some advanced economies, given what I described as the failure of our democratic political systems.
Thank you. Dominic, you're nodding your head. You're agreeing with the links, the effect that politics is having on the economics, or the effect that the economics is having on the politics. If we agree that the global economy has turned the corner for the better, can we be so bold as to say that this is a long-term projection in spite of the political headwinds we're seeing?
Well, first of all, this idea that we will be better. It's clear that we have a rebound in growth, 3.6% for 2017 is not nothing, but we're far from the pre-crisis level. Growth, investment, whatever the index you take. So that is number one. Number two, as it has been said previously, the recovery is broad-based. But broad-based doesn't mean everybody. About 75% of the global economy has growth, 25% still in a recession, which is halting all convergence prospect for 43 countries today. Quality among countries is increasing. The third point is that when you look at the figures, including in a period of low wages, incredibly low wages, which deter all our productivity-enhancing investments and create problems for the future. And if I may add one point, talking as a European, the Eurozone is doing surprisingly well, second to none, but India and China. But the question of the Brexit is still there. And the ways this Brexit will be detrimental to UK, certainly, but also to the things. So altogether, we're better off, but we're not that better off. That's risk, and you were talking about risk. I don't see short-term risk. I see medium-term or long-term risk. The first
Such
one,
as what? Okay.
yeah, first one is inequalities. Louis just talked about it, and that's obvious. Among countries and within countries. Among countries because of difference of development, and within countries because of low wages. So this point may be one of the biggest threats for the coming decade in the global economy, because it induces kind of geopolitical problems.
The populism we're seeing.
Absolutely. The second risk, I would say, is that mainly because of low wages, I see no buffer. No buffer for household, no buffer for non-financial corporation.
And by buffer, protecting
safety net saving, balance sheet, whatever. The result of that is that nobody's prepared to deal with or to cope with the next downturn. So I don't know when it's going to happen. As I said before, I don't really see risk in the short term, but in the medium term it will happen, and nobody's prepared for that. The third risk is a long-term risk, which has to do with declining labor productivity. That's one of the most frightening information I see in the data. Labor productivity is going down, and for the long term, that's something which is maybe dramatic. And the last point, if I may, is that we are dealing with global financial conditions that just Luis referred to, which are stabilized, that's correct. A lot of improvement have been made, still very sensitive to any reversal in capital flows. Same thing for China, who has to deal with its, let's say, financial excesses. And to do that, we need a special global policy in terms of, especially in terms of providing US dollar liquidity, which may happen, which has been the case in the last years, will probably go on in the coming years, but we just don't know. So we have four kinds of risks: inequalities, no buffer, low productivity, and financial condition, which makes the future not that nice.
Okay, Javier, you want to say something?
Yes, because just to clarify something. I agree with Dominique that we are not far from out of the woods. When one talks about 2019, it's compared to the recent years, but there's no way we will be back to the boom of the new millennium for a single reason. That's not repeatable. At that time,
why not?
The period of high global growth for all of us during the 2000s, in the run-up to the financial crisis, because that was exceptional and unsustainable. At that time, we had the consumption in the US and fed by bubbles, asset bubbles. We had the Eurozone booming because of an unsustainable asset bubble inside the Eurozone, undergoing a unique and repeatable structural transformation process. So there is no way we can go back that period. We should, the comparison is to be made with the recent past. And I would say that in the short time horizon of the next 2 years, the near-term risks are low. Even China. BIS was the first one last year to call attention dramatically to the super leverage that the China was going through. And then this year, surprisingly, to some extent, the IMF came with an Article 4 on China, very much punchy, more punchier than usual. But the fact is that you look at the credit to GDP ratio from the BIS last week, released last week, and it shows already that the Chinese are trying to curb the process.
So
it's the newer term, the kind of structural problems that both Luis and Dominique alluded to, is secular stagnation hypothesis and so on. But that's another.
Probably should have asked you the question I asked the audience at the beginning. What do you think is the outlook? You say, 3% sustained growth, but I get the sense from the panel that you agree with the 37% who said that there will be a new crisis and the sky will fall on our heads.
The risk of a crisis stems from the fact that given the lack of use of fiscal policy in advanced economies, too much resort was made to monetary policy, and that may have created a huge underlying level. The doubts, the jury is out on whether it will be possible to wind that smoothly.
Okay, Luis.
If you look at the answers that you provided us with, they are actually split. It's a third, and a big third at the end for the next crisis, right? So indeed, I think there are some elements of risks, even in the short term. If you take, for example, the fact that the way in which we got out of the global financial crisis was by exceptional, very unconventional policies done by central banks, which indeed, congratulate them, saved the world, but they also created a financial asset price bubble by providing this very large amount. Also, this easy money period corporate borrowing in the emerging world. We're talking about China, but we're talking about other emerging market corporates.
You side with the people who think the sky is going to fall on our heads imminently?
I think we are in this paradoxical situation where markets are essentially complacent about the situation that we are living with, and which is a very unstable equilibrium that can have a good end if we provide the structural reforms that would accompany this period and would enhance productivity, and we make us grow with a better quality, a different type of growth, and a more redistributive type of growth. And we are also a scenario where these things can go wrong. And if you have a possibility of a corporate crisis or a debt crisis in the emerging market, or if you have a task that some of the central banks are conducting to normalize their monetary policy with a lot of very skillful forward guidance about how they are going to tighten policies and reduce the overextended balance sheets that they have today. If this scenario goes wrong, and it can go wrong, for example, because inflationary expectations begin to jack up in the US. So this fragile equilibrium is predicated on and shows that markets are split, and that I think the audience here is also split about these results. However, I think we should look at the possibility of doing this with more structural reforms. But again, I come back to my point. For structural reforms, you need social consensus, and social consensus require a more redistributive.
Yeah, I agree with what you said about democracy and the necessity of some kind of political leadership and cohesion. But the point I wanted to come back is another one. It's obvious for everybody that monetary policy has done what it could be done, and that there's no way that we can expect more. The more we can expect it to go on that way, but the risk of the bubbles, the risk of the outcome is clear. My point is deficits and government debt are no more at the forefront of the public debate. So maybe it's time, as Ottaviano said before, to try to fix the roof in shiny times, which means taking advantage of the low rates to funds to be able to react when, I don't know when, but when the cycle will be worse than it is now. So I know that this kind of idea is heterodox and most of people don't like it. Still, I believe that in the same way that the IMF in 2008, 2009 pushed the rest of the world to have more public spending to avoid a crisis that could have been as big as the Great Depression. In the same way, on the other side, now that we are in better situation, I think it's the right time to build this kind of counter-cyclical funds. I don't see any country going in this direction.
So you've gone into proposals, how we correct the situation. Audience, I'd just like to remind you that you can use your AD Connect to ask questions. We'll also have a microphone that challenges the thinking of our panelists, given that they're all IMF, World Bank. There might be some alternative perspectives out there. And so while you do that, let me come to you, Antoinette. Yes.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to say that, of course, the situation for the advanced countries is different than those for low-income countries in sub-Saharan Africa in particular. And the fiscal situation is indeed a big challenge for a number of countries in the region right now. Deficits are large, and they have been increasing. Debt levels are particularly high. More than 50% of GDP in a number of half of the sub-Saharan African countries. That's a big change. And so countries really do have to deal with the fiscal deficit and with debt, which is in the process of also jeopardizing countries, being squeezed out of being able to draw on financing. So debt levels are a concern. I talked about the fact that the global financial situation was a bit better, which has propelled a number of countries to borrow more this year. In some sense, that's good. Debt by itself is not a sin. It's the accumulation, the pace of accumulation we're seeing that is a concern for a number of countries in the region.
Okay, yeah. So I have a question for you in the audience. The other part of the topic we're dealing with is implications for development. Our economists here have been, have shared their perspectives with us. They haven't quite told us that the sky will fall on our head, but they predict it will fall on on our heads. So given the situation that we find ourselves in, what do you think? Go to your AD Connect. This will prompt you to just enter some words. And what do you think are the implications for development? You know, some of the things I'm hearing are that we need to focus on our public debt. Some of these issues need to come back to the forefront of public debate, but there seems to be unanimous agreement that public debt levels are unsustainable. I think the thing that came out sharply for me, Ottaviano, was that we will not see the sort of boom that we did in the early 2000s. So what does this mean? Yeah? So that should be projected on the word cloud. In one word, what are the implications? The 18 global economic outlook, that we will continue to grow, the growth will be uneven, and that Africa, which is the theme for this year's Atlantic Dialogue convening, needs to work a bit harder to achieve sustainable growth. Okay, they're agreeing with the panelists: fiscal, reprioritize, discipline, accountability. Okay, and that's gone. So, so the audience, at least on that level, seem to agree with you. Fiscal policies, discipline, reprioritizing. So, what do you on development discourse that we're talking about? Muted but uneven. I think I'll start with you, Luis, given your BIS and central banks.
I think there is a topic that we didn't really mention here, is that the catching up process of developing countries vis-à-vis advanced economies. There is an issue of how the digital economy will affect our societies and our lives. And there are relatively few answers to this. Remember that technological change affects more labor markets in advanced economies than trade. And how developing countries, and particularly African countries, will be capable to catch up. Trade patterns will change, the content of labor in our final products will change, of labor markets in advanced economies will change. So this is a big issue. This has to be addressed probably by a rethinking of the way in which we work in our societies.
And what do you think the rethinking of that should look like?
I think probably it has to do with changing the educational systems in our societies. The way in which we learn, the way in which we are capable of specializing across our lifetime of work in different tasks. I mean, the way in which jobs will not be stable jobs forever. The learning by doing, but also the learning continuously through our life would be an important goal. And this has implications for emerging economies, for African economies. However, for African economies is that there is a huge potential here for, at the same time, this type of development, also infrastructure-led development and numerical infrastructure, the internet-based development here. So these are leads that I think for societies that have, like African societies, a low carbon print, the capacity to evolve towards a new type of model of growth with more equality and with, of course, some of the parameters of macro stability that we know are important for growth, is, I think, a good news.
So the European Union has been doing this, the African Union has been attempting to do it through its Africa 2063 agenda, and we'll have to see how that goes. Dominique, you'd wanted to say something, but Ottaviano.
Take that important point made by Luis, which is the following. He's right. The new technologies industry in new challenges, global value chains, despite the fact that some African countries were counting on moving into the steps of low-skilled manufacturing. I'm thinking of Ethiopia, but not only that. And whereas we have this movement back of some activities to the core countries, unwinding some of the global value chains. That's a huge challenge, but it does not eliminate all possibilities that some countries here in the region might catch up, taking the void left by China. On infrastructure, let me say the following. The eventual fiscal difficulties only private-public partnerships, blending, using the investment participation, the public sector participation, more into unlocking, crowding in private sector investment. So there is no necessary contradiction between fiscal discipline and raising up investments in infrastructure, which will
but then
raise
what would
growth,
fiscal
whatever.
discipline look like then? What would fiscal discipline look
No,
like?
but look, that's the point. Fiscal discipline is not necessarily unfriendly to having higher investments in infrastructure. It depends on the way by which projects or public resources are used to to match-make the opportunities with private investors. Most thought outside the box will be necessary exactly to make possible to live both with fiscal discipline and higher investments in infrastructure.
And it also depends, I would say, on the success that is seen in really mobilizing more revenues, which for a number of countries in the region is quite low. Progress has been made, but still a lot to be done, especially in oil exporters again, in raising the non-oil revenues. That's a big challenge. Nigeria, for example, is barely 6% of GDP revenues, total revenues. And there's quite a bit of potential there that needs to be tapped on if fiscal consolidation is going to be friendly to growth. And as Ottaviano was saying, I mean, you can do a lot in protecting, more revenues.
Okay, Dominique, and then Louise.
Yeah, the point is, all the question you're asking about what maybe the consequences on Africa, need, I think, to make a difference between the oil exporters countries and the other one. They're in a very different situation.
Right. So is it just oil exporters or commodity-dependent economies?
You're right. Commodity exporters at large, but especially in this period, oil exporters. And with the low price of commodities, especially of oil, you have a set of countries in Africa who are just unable to make it. Partly because what they had done in the previous period was not adapted to a possible change in the oil prices, which is their responsibility, and in IFA's responsibility too. But whatever the responsibility, some countries may benefit from global growth, and some may just lag behind. So the question of inequality within Africa and within different countries in Africa is really, for me, one to put on the top of the pile. And in my view, most institutions, global institutions and advanced economy don't take care enough of what's happening now for those countries in Africa. You can have a long list of rather small or medium-sized countries in Africa who are really in a bad situation, and it's going to go on for the coming years because of the commodity prices. So that's something we have to really take care and to make a difference in Africa between the type of countries.
Luis, you wanted to say something?
Well, you pointed out that this is a panel composed of the wrong policies. Look, actually, I think some common sense policies are, everybody's at everybody's advantage. And I think here's a way in which I think this is a word in which we need coordination of policies, because some of the policies that are undertaken at the national level could end up, let's say, being or spilling over into other countries and having negative externalities and negative impact on others. So you need some place where people talk
Dominique
about good policies.
Yeah, that's a very important point. Remember the last crisis, and one of the reasons why cope with the crisis was that there has been a global cooperation as never before within the G20, the G8, the G20, especially the G20. And as soon as the crisis was behind us, or at least partly behind us, every country, most of the country came back to their domestic problem, forgetting about the cooperation. Cooperation in the globalized economy is absolutely necessary, but we don't see this now. And probably one of the reasons of the possible risk for the future come from this lack of cooperation, which means comes back to what Louis was saying about nationalism and all this kind of thing.
Things, because I did challenge them to come up with alternative perspectives to the IMF and World Bank consensus that we seem to have reflected on the panel. If you've got any questions, please put your hands up and the mics will come to you. But in the meantime, a statement of fact. Inequality will be destabilizing and would make politics of reform harder. That's, fairly clear. What are your views of tax breaks for companies to generate growth and invest in R&D? Who asked that question? Okay, thank you. Frenny, formerly of the World, of the ADB. Yes, and the World. Okay, and the World Bank. So who would like to take that one? Antoinette, actually, I think you should. What are your views of tax breaks for companies to generate growth and invest in R&D?
Maybe broader than that. I think, look, everything that has to do with the way in which we finance innovation is important to consider, whether it is through perhaps tax breaks, but also considering new vehicles for investors, such as green bond financing. Of course, there is an issue of certification. Mm-hmm. Everything can be painted green and then reveal itself at the end not being so green. But I think we need to think of how we can deal with growth of a greater quality, and meaning with a lower carbon print. It means that we have to finance innovation. It means that we have to understand the way in which society can move towards a more environmental friendly type of growth, and it has to do with some redistribution as well.
Okay, Antoinette, did you have a perspective?
No, I would just say that it's important for countries to really look at circumstances under which they give tax breaks, given their very challenging revenue situation currently in the region.
The World Bank, to some extent, reflects a moment in which the World Bank is small. It's little, the backstop financing. The World Bank is losing entirely. It's nothing. To raise capital is humongous. It's not likely to happen. So the mentality that has been prevailing is something like the World Bank will be a boutique. It will only support projects that are really special and leave the rest to the markets or to regional development banks and so on. And so this will lead to this increasing selectivity. No, we only finance specific projects that can be proved to be on the upstream fight against climate change. Is simply they were not big enough anymore to do substantive things like this. So it has become too selective. Hopefully, it's one side of the fragmentation of the multilateral order. We have the emergence and rising up of other separate plurilateral institutions.
Luis?
Well, I mean, I think we all realize that financing the energy transition towards a lower carbon print economy is going to take huge amounts of resources. It's not only to be something that will be dealt with by international financial institutions. We have to create, I think all of us here, the proper business conditions for private interest to be, in their own self-interest. The transition economy a lower carbon print.
Dominic?
Yeah, that's absolutely true, but it comes back to the previous question. It cannot be done at the level of one country alone.
Absolutely.
So it needs to be done, at least if not globally, at least globally enough, which goes back to the cooperation question.
And some funds that can be developed precisely through a coordination dialogue, throughout ways in which you can create incentives. Now, the good news is that I think because African economies have so far a low carbon print, it's probably easier to engineer a good transition in those economies with private sector interest, because also the returns to these investments will be large at the global level, but also at the local level in this coordinated.
Okay, hand up if you've got any questions. And yes, sir.
I'm Mouraglo. I'm economist in the Prime Minister's office in Senegal. In the case of Africa, where we receive a lot of funds from World Bank or IMF, sometimes in conceptual terms, or like subsidies, you can have fiscal discipline, tight monetary policy, non-appreciation of the exchange rate, and still growth. So this is the case, I think, when we think about Africa, we should take care of this, because generally when you do modeling, you don't take care of those subsidies or concessional. But
Thank
if you by having monetary policy, fiscal discipline, non-application of the exchange rate in a fixed exchange rate like.
Very much. And the 7% number is a magic number because that's the projection for what we need to get out of.
It's not necessary.
It's what we need to
get
out of.
The miracle is 9%, 9 to 9.5%.
9.5%.
Not 7.
Not 7. SDGs.
What is good is 9.5%.
Okay. What is good is 9.5. Thank you very much for that, sir. You've got a microphone. Yes. Go ahead.
Patrick Worms from the World Agroforestry Center. Africa is full of entrepreneurs. 70% of the population are smallholder farmers. That means there are people who live by their wits. There are people who only live from the income that they can generate by the hard work on their soil. What these entrepreneurs need is, first, security of tenure, higher incomes. Second, knowledge, which is far more important than chemistry or seeds, so that they can improve their agronomic interventions and understand how to exploit the natural processes that surround them rather than fight against them. And three, infrastructure, so that they have roads and post-farm processing equipment to bring their goods to market and capture more of the value that their hard work is generating. What can the large institutions do to bring these fundamental things, which are not apps, they are not a GPS, they are not a smartphone, and they are not some genetically engineered marvel, they are basics. What can you do to bring these basics to Africa's farmers?
Thank you very much. And those are, if you could project the previous question, I make it of it. The previous question, if you could project that, please. What can we do about inequality in the context of the need for higher growth? And so, Dominic, you talked about inequality, quite sharply. And the question about what can we do, large institutions, Ottaviano, I'll give that to you.
Good.
Go ahead.
Well, on this one, look, I fully agree with the agenda that you outlined. These are the paths for African and, in general, most in developing countries, particularly income countries, to grow. The first item that you mentioned, land titling, I would say the chapter of the so-called business in emerging markets. Multilateral institutions in that regard is policy advice here and there, but the bulk of the task is on you, is on the country, because this means changing regulations, laws, and things like those that not are to the domain of multilateral institutions. First, on infrastructure. Infrastructure, as I said, there is a lot as well that can be done, provided that there is an appropriate regulatory environment, as well as the scarce resources are used to pull in, to crowd in other investors. Don't expect multilateral institutions because they don't have the size nor the governance appropriate for that. Basically, what the country decides to do on technology, I see a higher scope for cooperation in that regard. For instance, the experience developed in Brazil with high technology agriculture, which is not necessarily high scale. It can be adapted even for smaller levels of land use. Definitely contains a lot of lessons that can be adapted in African countries, not only because of soil, because of institutional conditions, and so on. But again, that's an area where more cooperation must be sought. Cannot wait for multilateral bureaucracies to take the initiative. It's clearly hinges. I guess we can all agree here how the smallness of many African economies has not been addressed appropriately, in the sense that not enough cooperation in the region has taken place. There are efforts, but the results have not have fallen far short from what they could. Definitely, it would facilitate the establishment of mechanism of technology transfer. Again, agree with you, infrastructure, technology transfer, and land titling as a chapter of business environment. But ultimately, multilateral institutions can help the countries to but cannot rebuild structures in the countries.
No, I very much agree with that. And I look back to facilitate access to more infrastructure, for example. One of the driving policy changes in the fund in the course of the last several years has been the change to the debt limits policies that allowed sub-Saharan African countries to tap into some non-concessional financing that they needed for infrastructure. And in particular, to be able to draw on financing from China and other new lenders. And that has been a big change, but it is countries' own responsibility to manage that appropriately. And there's a question about whether that's been managed appropriately, and whether the value, the high quality of infrastructure is enough to justify that concessional financing to be able to repay it. So countries have their responsibilities as well as facilitate more access to financing, no question about that. It's encouraging to see the compact with Africa, the G20 compact with Africa, beginning to really propel more FDI and infrastructure from the private sector in sub-Saharan Africa. But how countries manage that will also be extremely important.
So these are similar themes carrying on from the first session about African countries acting to take ownership and responsibility.
It is first and foremost their responsibilities.
Yeah.
As an African, I can say that very strongly. I helped to manage an economy, a very small one. We took a war, devastating one, and we tried to write things quickly to try to turn the page. And Africa has to do more of that, frankly.
So keep saying this, that Africa has to do more. Why aren't we doing more?
Well, it's a complicated political challenge. And, some were saying that, Obi and others in the beginning, in the first session. There are vested interests that are difficult to manage, to deal with. There are pressures from different stakeholders, but it is the responsibility of elected leaders to manage that and to build consensus for more reform. Mm-hmm. And that's the challenge. That's where partners can also help to do that more. That is really the challenge in a world where, of course, is acknowledged to be the solution, but how you manage those vested interests in that process is really difficult, struggling with.
But can you disrupt that if you're not dealing with a favorable political situation? If there are people, if we agree that we have 350 influential people here who are trying to make, to do the best by their countries, within a political system that doesn't quite get it, can we disrupt? Luis is saying yes.
Yeah, well, you have to try. And we have here in this place here two excellent examples of people that worked, Antoinette, Obi, worked in international institutions, but also tried in their own countries to make things better for their citizens, for everyone around the table. And this is what is important. I think one other characteristics of this post-modern world in which we are, this is really bad. The fact that you don't have anymore this belief that by doing things, even if the environment is different, then I think it's probably worse than just falling into sort of pessimism or something else. I think what we need is to precisely combat cynicism.
Dominique.
Yeah, one point which I find really striking is that we would have this conversation 10 years ago, or let's say 15 years ago. There would have been a lot of ideological dispute about what should be done, what kind of policy. This has totally disappeared. We almost all agree on what to be done. I guess that around us in this room, on 90% of what of the different policies we may agree. Of course, into another, but globally we know what to do. The question is, why, as you asked the question, why are this kind of policies not implemented? And then end of politics. At the end of the day, the surprising situation in which we are with globalization is that economic questions are no more that much economic question, technical question, but political question. And the problem is the will to do it, the possibility to avoid the vested interest, the possibility to implement the right policy. But we know almost what are the right policies to be put in place.
Antoinette and Obi, I'll ask you a question. Given your experience in government, because we've been accused of sitting on the sidelines and throwing stones at the politician in government, given your experience?
Never a politician, and I say that. Minister of Finance, I was never a politician, and some of my biggest challenges was dealing with the politicians in our legislature in particular. And one knows when to say, I think I've done what I can under the circumstances, and I think I can do better in helping Liberia in doing other things. And that's where I reached when I decided not to continue. Having said that, if I had a government that I was convinced wanted to do the right things, I would absolutely be eager to serve. It's the most exhilarating experience one can have, to actually feel that your actions are really moving.
Obi, can we please get a microphone? Obi, please. So like Antoinette, you also were part of the team, no, Obi, that helped structuring. Would you serve in government again, given your experience, given what you know?
Well, since I left government, I've had the call by the respective governments.
I'm sure you have.
And I have said no. I have said no. And the reason that I have said no is that I actually think that our democracy needs to be strengthened. And I felt that the demand side, which is the citizens being active and engaged, was too weak. And so we're going to keep getting low quality democracies. And so I put my weight more to build a citizen who understands the office of the citizen that is important to equilibrate the monopoly powers of the supply side of our democracies. So for me, that's a very good place to be at this time in my life.
Okay, thank you very much. Martina, you've got a question for us, yes?
Yes, and thank you for the last input, because it gave me courage to say what I'm going to say. We live in a time where we are very focused on numbers, and we are very material. We are also in a time where it's changing a little bit, but I think one of the things that we do not talk enough about is our spiritual connection. And even when we're talking about the economy, it is connected to whether we live our lives with a purpose and with a conscious leadership. Coming back to what you were just saying, that the people that are voting at the moment, they're actually not educated enough, they're not at a level where they're able to choose the right leaders. So we need, coming back to you, we need to focus more on educating people, and it's not just a STEM education. It is not about numbers and figures. It has to be about a personal development, in my opinion. It has to be about your connection to a purpose and living and leading a conscious leadership. And that conscious leadership will also make you consider the environment itself. So it's about your own personal purpose and leading with a mission in your life. And I don't know how the financial institutions, IMF, World Bank, can start looking more at that. There are actually esoteric science, there are ways of measuring people's consciousness, there are ways of educating people. One of the elements is meditation. So there are things that you can actually do physically and materially that you can do to implement the economic debate.
Okay, thank you, Martina. So interesting perspectives we've heard, educating people, building to our spiritual health. But remember that the topic of this conversation was the state of the world's economy and its implications for development. And so the responses I've heard, muted growth, uneven, unequal, the implications for development, possibly sporadic, we need new innovation. But as we wind up, what do you think is the one thing we've got to do to ensure, and I think I might have heard snippets of this from both the audience and you panelists, that if we want to ensure that we, the coming downturns, Dominique, you told us, it will happen again. What is the one thing we must do? You have to, yeah, you needed to put your hand up, Obi. Thank you.
Would you say we have the leadership globally to respond to the situation we find ourselves? I think we are in a new economic state. And in this new economic state, we seem to lack the global leadership that's able to understand it and to do what's needful. It's politically costly to make certain things happen in the new economic state. Would you guys think that we have the kind of time like this in the history of humanity?
Come on, thank you. That's a fantastic question. Antoinette, yes.
No, your first question to say that more progress on cooperating multilaterally is extremely important for the prospects of the region of sub-Saharan Africa. And of course, leadership is critical in that regard. And what we're seeing in some advanced countries today in terms of the pressures of protectionism, of populism, is not welcoming of efforts to support growth in developing countries. And so that, from that perspective, certainly leadership could be much better in terms of support efforts of developing countries. But as we said before, leadership in developing countries themselves have to propel, better policies to support growth. So that's how I respond.
Leadership. We are well, various populists in the world.
I think it would be an understatement, but Obi, I think there are some holes in the leadership. That's why globally, that's why it's important to focus on the coordinating mechanisms that remain. The forums where there are ways in which we can talk to each other, this one being one of them, but also the G20, the World Bank, the IMF, of course, areas where we talk about financial stability, the FSB, the BIS. But I think we have to understand.
But aren't your numbers, the membership of these coordinating institutions, determined by those leaders themselves? Okay, so they elect and nominate people to positions who will carry out their agendas.
Well, but disseminate, come to the awareness of the citizens of this world is also important. And more, the pressure for conducting policies that are for the common good of the global economy are, I think, surfacing. So there is an awareness. Look at, for example, the COP21 event. Even if there is a large stakeholder that has defected, there is also sympathy and renewal of actions towards having a more sustainable development path and more environmental friendly strategy. So it's not as simple as we miss one big leadership drive and then all is lost. I think it's the responsibility of everyone in the areas to address some of these gaps. Again, it is important to have in mind that we need to build a sustainable growth. The distribution of benefits and costs of globalization. If we don't realize that, if we're not capable of showing this path to the global citizens, I think we will be in trouble.
Dominique?
Yeah, all this is true. But if I may disagree on one point, is that usually part of the economic leadership, for the good or for the bad, comes from the United States. We cannot expect any more.
So you've been brave enough to name them, because we've been going around in circles not naming them.
Okay, after Trump election, I don't believe that we can expect for a couple of years in the United States. At the same time, the situation in Europe is such that probably you cannot expect either to have a strong leadership coming from Europe. So the result of that is that the only countries trying to have this leadership of the world are China, Russia, and some countries where leadership is strong, maybe not exactly the kind of leadership we like, but it's a leadership which is strong. And if
you don't see it coming out of Africa.
Well, and if we're not able to build something with the global, with all the countries, that's back to the theme of cooperation, then this leadership will be just split around the world without any kind of good consequences. Africa, obviously, can be part of the group of countries, Latin America, and that's the goal, that's the topic of cooperation. But I don't know what's the probability to have this kind of thing emerging, but if it's leadership to help us to get out, not the situation we are in, which is not that bad, but the situation we may be in a couple of years.
So we've got just 5 minutes left. I'm going to treat these as your closing remarks because I'd like to poll the audience before we wind up. So Otavio, quickly, please.
I don't want the question on education to get lost.
Spirituality.
Because, the thing is, I would recommend reading the World Development Report produced this year, which is on education. And one important aspect of it is the following. The traditional, the young people being input to production processes is losing meaning. And that means that develop memorization of things and so on, which includes building up characters, social skills, and so on. Second thing, you talk about the main leaders having the ability to nominate the heads of institutions. One of the manifestations of the crisis at which we are comes from the fact that the U.S. has been questioning multilateral institutions, well established, WTO and so on. So it doesn't mean that you have a good correlation between having the governors, and we need good leadership. And the current leaders bring the agenda to closeness to their own countries, the worse we are. One important thing is almost a perfect correlation, a negative correlation between backlashes to globalization and the presence of social protection systems. I truly believe that the reason why you didn't see the backlashes anti-globalization in Japan, in Scandinavian countries, and you had them in the US and the UK, stems, and only to the intermediate point in France, is the fact that all the countries that have coped well with the globalization have been those with social protection systems. So that's the message. That's if there is proof, I would say improve your social protection systems to make them resilient to shocks, to the temptations.
Speak in 1 minute.
I think we have every crisis reveals shortcomings. The Great Depression called for the Keynesianism and aggregate demand management policies. This one, we are learning that we need to understand the financial crisis. We need to understand the way they work, they affect everybody's lives. And we need also to understand the way in which globalization needs to be rethought to be a more positive things for all stratas of society, meaning that we have to think of its positive aspects, and there are indeed many in terms of trade integration, in terms of global value chains, policies in countries and across countries, which means, again, the topic of the need for coordination.
Thank you very much. So the poll question I asked at the beginning, I'd just like to see how we've done, whether we've shifted mindsets. And the question was, if you could mount the question for me, please. Take out your AD Connect gadgets, your mobile phones. And the question we asked at the beginning, what is your outlook for the global economy in 2018? Great, we're growing, growing, growing. What the economist said, there will be a new crisis and the sky will definitely fall on your heads. It's unfortunate that the panel thought that the sky would fall on our heads, but I'd love to see what you think, you know, having heard from our, you know, distinguished panel here. How much time do we have to vote on this? Let's see what the trend. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. What do we think? What is your outlook for the... Oh, my goodness.
Well.
Oh, my word. I'm not sure that this is what they set out to do. But there we are. Yes, Luis.
Look, we were split about a third.
Please keep it up. Yes.
We were split for about a third. We are realizing that yes, indeed, we are facing more severe problems, and I think it's good news because if we understand, I think we're being a bit
different. No, absolutely. I think the prospects certainly in the long term for the region are good. That's to start with. But to get to those prospects, you have to manage the present, right? And the present is challenging from the perspective of dealing with the shocks that the region has faced and adjusting to them, from the perspective of improving the multilateral coordination that is important for improving the global prospects itself. We don't want 5 years from now to have all of the regions in sub-Saharan Africa at high risk of debt distress. A third of them are now, so we better do something about that.
Keep it up, please. Keep it up. Yes, Ottaviano.
The question is, it is impossible to get, among other reasons, because it's not written yet. It will depend a lot on what key leaders decided to do, whether a Trump goes awry in trade, whether we have a geopolitical risk, and so on. But the baseline remains steady for next year. That's it. That's the most likely scenario.
Dominic, your response to the poll?
Well, I think there's a problem with the question.
You had a problem with the question, okay.
Because the question is talking about 2018. So 2018, I would say we will grow, so I have no problem with 2018. The question is the years after. So I think the vote should be for 2018, no problem. For after, even more problem than expected.
Okay, so thank you very much. Our panel has kept it real, and so please show your appreciation for them, for sharing your experience and your expertise with us. Panelists, thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention and your participation during this first morning. Please enjoy your lunch. We will convene at 2:30 sharp. Bon appétit.